George Garrett Burniston was born in Sydney in 1914, educated at Sydney High School and the University of Sydney, from where he graduated in 1939. From humble beginnings, he became an architect of rehabilitation for people with disability in Australia, and through his involvement in international organisations, he influenced the policy-making decisions within the United Nations and the World Health Organisation in developing rehabilitation internationally. After graduation, like many of his generation, he was a resident medical officer and was commissioned then as a flight lieutenant in the Royal Australian Air Force, and medical services, and he was allocated to Great Britain, where he served with the Royal Air Force Medical Services and had opportunity to meet pioneers in orthopaedic surgery, neurosurgery and plastic surgery in his postgraduate career. Regrettably, wartime brings many of the greatest advances in medical and surgical care. And very early in his career, he became aware that unless there was an outcome policy for the treatment of severely injured people, then excellent acute medical and surgical care did not always return them to productive life afterwards. George referred to the field of rehabilitation medicine as the Cinderella of medical specialties, but through his perseverance, it became recognised as a principal specialty in Australia and New Zealand, offering a career structure for young doctors. Post-war, he returned to Australia and became important in the development of Commonwealth rehabilitation services in Australia. He was a foundation diplomate of physical medicine and rehabilitation of the Australian Postgraduate Federation in 1970, and he became involved in the discussion in the formation of the Australian College of Rehabilitation Medicine from the early 1980s that morphed into the faculty we have today. He was elected a member of the Royal Society of Medicine in 1972, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Health in 1973, and was a member of the WHO expert panel on medical rehabilitation for more than 20 years. George was not a dinosaur great one. George was intensely practical, and more than one of his registrars relates the experience of landing in his ward at Prince Henry Hospital on the first day and being asked, "Who is the first patient this morning?" And most young registrars would answer, "It's Fred Smith in bed 1. And George's response to that was usually, "Who is George Smith?" emphasising not the person, but the who of the person. He was very important on communication and understanding of holistic care well before his time. It gives me great pleasure then to introduce my colleague, Associate Professor Michael Pollack, who will be giving the Burniston Oration today on shifting definitions of health and illness, the role of rehabilitation. Michael graduated from medicine at the University of New South Wales in 1981, qualified as a rehab medicine specialist in 1988, and was part of the executive when the former college morphed into the Australasian Faculty of Rehab Medicine in the mid-1990s, and at that time Michael chaired the Board of Continuing Education. Michael has always been predominantly a clinician, working as a staff specialist at John Hunter since 1991, with a focus on stroke rehabilitation, spinal cord impairment, pain management and biomechanics. He's been a Director of Rehabilitation Medicine in Hunter, New England, and established their stroke service from 1995 onwards. And Michael firmly believes that maintaining clinical quality is based on a solid understanding of research, effective team processes and diagnostic accuracy in holistic patient care. He has co-chaired the National Stroke Foundation working parties that wrote the first Australian guidelines in stroke rehabilitation, and he is currently the chair of the AFRM Research Committee. And I might also note that Michael was George Burniston's registrar in George's last year of clinical practice at Prince Henry Hospital. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. I just want to start off by saying thank you very much to the honour being done to me by the College and the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine. I'm certainly humbled by it, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to all of you here. This is a logo that's, I think, recognised by most of us as question and answers. I often come to conferences to find answers to my questions. In this presentation here, I just want to say that I think what I present is going to be known to most of you, but hopefully it will raise some questions even if I don't provide the answers. As an overview, I will be talking about a brief history of health, the current context of health, what are our current pressures for change, and what is the role of rehabilitation through all of this. It is both pleasing and a little bit embarrassing to say that a lot of what I will be talking about today, what I'm presenting, has been covered in a number of the talks that I've heard through this Congress. It's excellent to see because that means that these points are current and trending, and that's worthwhile. And if it's repetition, then I can only say that it can be worthwhile because it certainly assists my learning. So I want to start off with the World Health Organization definition of health as it currently stands, and just point out that this definition was actually created and published in 1948. And I gather that it really hasn't changed much since then, although the World Health definition, the World Health Organization has been providing a lot of other information and considerations on top of this. But it's already been quoted in this Congress that health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And if we bear this in mind as we look back through our history, then that may be useful for comparison and contrast. As we look back through the history, we might start with the Smith Papyrus, which was allegedly created in about 1600 BCE and is a written record, as I think many of you know, probably the first written record that we've found of a process of recommendations for management of conditions, mostly surgical orthopaedic and thought to be useful in battles. But it replaced or started the replacement of what had been in the earliest days religious and mystical interpretations and treatments for uncertain interpretations of what health and disease really was. With the older civilizations, health and disease started to include some concepts of nature, which really is very interesting how they explored that. Empiricism was coming through and allowed some categorisation and prognostication, and medical and surgical interventions began to be added to the base of religious and mystic therapies. Hippocrates, regarded as we all know as the father of medicine, actually freed medicine from the shackles of magic and superstition and the supernatural because he started to collect data and conduct experiments. And then Galen, following on from Hippocrates, going from Greek to Roman, developed a model of health and disease that was based around understanding that these things were the result of a balance of a range of factors, including elements, human qualities, the various humours excreted and secreted by the human body, organ systems, timing, such as time of the year or time of the day, and the balance was a key issue. And this picture here is a picture of Hippocrates turning back a gift but trying to be presented to him by Alexander the Great. By the Middle Ages, things had shifted somewhat and there became a dominance of theological perspectives for health and disease, and illness was regarded as a coincident of physical entity and an act of God. There were recordings of specific health rules about how to live a good life. It is said that the modern era of health really started with the commencement of the Renaissance, and at that time, with secularisation, empiricism, causality, research, began to gradually take dominance in the health philosophies, moving beyond some of the religious priorities that had preceded it. And with the era of Enlightenment, there was associatedly a more greater awareness of public health, social reform, and indeed already at this time books were being published on prevention and on rehabilitation. This picture here, painted in the mid-1600s, is titled "A Lady Washing Her Hands." And one might wonder about why this was of such great import back then and what the implications and understanding of this act was at that time. So, having covered a brief history, and I'm sorry if I've missed out your favourite physicians and surgeons over the ages, but in looking back at it, it's important to understand that concepts of health and disease have always been a reflection as well as an influence on the knowledge and the philosophy and the culture of the era. Understanding of influences on health and factors in illness have shifted as knowledge and science has improved, but basic concepts of health and disease as being a balance between the functioning of the body and mind, a balance including the environment, individual and community activities and diet, as well as cultural and religious beliefs, has really been present for centuries, but with varying emphasis. So if we look at the current concepts of health and look at the broader context in which we see health these days, I want to go back not too far, but to 1977, when George Engel first published the biopsychosocial model of health, which moved beyond the basic biomedical model that had come to dominance during the age of enlightenment, the era of enlightenment. But it's only this year, 2018, in the British Medical Journal, that we had an editorial that started off by saying that they want to introduce the biopsychosocial model for good medicine and for good doctors. But I'll still quote from it because it's very meaningful. It is no longer sufficient for clinicians to state that treatment is successful in terms of its effect on specific biological illness. It's now also necessary to know whether the treatment gives significant improvement in the way in which a person lives. And also this editorial is important because it highlights the fact that changes have to occur at a political level. And we wonder now about who drives the political agenda in health. In 2001, the World Health Organization clarified a statement and produced this document which really looked at more clearly describing and measuring both health and disability, introducing them as both separate and connected entities. And it highlighted that the functioning and the disability of an individual always occurs in a context, including environmental factors. This is their diagram of how it all interacts. It provides a definition around disability and highlights issues of impairment, activity limitation, and participation restrictions, concepts which I'm sure we all know clearly. The diagram really serves to highlight that health as a whole isn't just a reflection of absence of disease, but really looks at the functioning of the individual, including personal factors, environmental factors. Disease and illness impacts on capacity to carry out activities and participation and results in an overall health condition. So some of our contemporary concepts indeed are that contemporary medicine increasingly faces the task not only of overcoming sickness, but also preserving health. Prevention and rehabilitation play increasingly important roles alongside curative therapies. Health can also be regarded as the ability to bear injury, handicaps, and the anticipation of death, and here's the point, to successfully integrate these alongside and into one's life. Very often we see these days many examples of people moving around theoretically with illness consequences, and whether that means moving around in a wheelchair or with an artificial limb or having sensory impairments, but these things are no longer limitations on our lives. And as a result, does that mean that these people are healthy or are not healthy? And I put that as a question to help us consider the 1948 definition of the World Health Organization for health, their definition for health, as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being. There's many people who have raised questions about the use of the word complete. And also the fact that in addressing this, there are many people moving around, contributing greatly to their own lives, to their families and to the community, who don't necessarily have the absence of disease or infirmity. So all these things are considered now in a political and social context, and indeed this definition in 1948 carried different political messages than it might carry today. The determinants of health are therefore considered in a much broader context, and a number of speakers throughout the Congress have commented on the social determinants of health. I put it here to summarise what we know, but to help reinforce the messages. These things have been shown to impact on health: income and social status, education, which includes concepts of stress and lower self-confidence, physical environment, which we might come to later on in this presentation, and that includes employment and access to employment, social support networks. Culture has come back into it, bearing in mind how far back we know it's influenced health in history. Genetics, personal behaviour and coping skills, which is partly genetically related, health services and access, and gender. This is the American interpretation of the social determinants of health, which I put up to show that it can be graphed in a much more simple way than I've presented. We also have to remember that we do talk about population health and health of our communities, not just individual health, but all of which has similar impacts and determinants. So let's look at the current pressures for change in our model of health now. And I'm quoting a number of recent articles and papers in the last 12 months. Healthcare is ripe for disruption. Are we ready for the tipping point? And we see here that the commentary is that there are regulatory changes enabling different reimbursement models, new data, new insights, revolutionised diagnostic capabilities, able to personalise care, and consumers wanting to have the same convenience that online shopping and ordering and Uber provides. This article, Why Reforming Healthcare is Integral for Our Economy. Healthcare is becoming a business, not only just a business, but a key driver in our economy. And for economic reasons, we're now seeing that healthcare needs to be reformed, not just because of clinical evidence. We see that the Productivity Commission can highlight how healthcare sector needs to change. This is the Productivity Commission, not just the health regulators. There's a greater need for longer term. On my screen it's gone off. So you can read this more clearly yourself than I can off this screen. The innovation healthcare really needs help people manage their own health. And we've already heard from a number of speakers, again through this Congress, about how the consumers of our healthcare really want and deserve, and it's appropriate for them to have a stronger voice, the empowering of consumers. And this moves into this article from earlier this year in the MJA of self-management support for patients with chronic disease, potential and questions, but highlighting that even though we know it works, there are still significant questions about what works and for whom. So as the consumers claim more space and more empowerment, and as we consider how we provide our advice to patients and others, the concept of nudging has come back in, where if we don't provide overt recommendations for our patients, we now have the option of providing subconscious nudges to change the way people behave and act. the application of nearly every advance in medicine is human behaviour, is what has been said here in the New England Journal of Medicine. Clinicians' and patients' environments influence directions, and choice architecture, which influences directions, has really becoming to the fore recently. And an example of nudging here is how urban design can make a difference between influencing whether we may choose to walk versus drive, or influence how we may choose to use public transport versus not use public transport. As we explore this, however, we also have to remember that in our society now, we have to address the needs of a wider range of people with persisting limitations that have the right and the ability, or the right and the need to access our society. It's not just dealing with people who previously had been the ones regarded only as able-bodied. The environment is having a bigger and bigger, or we're understanding a bigger and bigger impact of the environment. And this article from over 10 years ago, nearly 15 years ago, talking about genetic and environmental factors in this condition of Huntington's disease that we all know well, that had been regarded as pathognomically representing a purely genetic disease process predetermined at birth about the impact on the individual. And we now see that certain simple environmental changes can in fact delay the onset of cognitive impacts and indeed make a difference in maintaining a quality of life simply with environmental change. I admit to one of my conflicts with this. I am the co-author of a small chapter of a section of a chapter of this book. I don't know if I get any royalties from it, but if you all go out and buy one, I'll tell you how much I earn. But within this book that was published earlier this year, Nature and Public Health, it does really highlight that there is a lot of growing evidence of the public health impact of nature, but also the impact that environment can have on us as individuals, including documentable, measurable, objective changes in our neurophysiology and our biochemistry. And its role in repair and recovery is probably something that even at this day is underestimated. So even at the level of the city, we can find compassion. And we're now looking at compassionate cities to help us to live better, not just the focus on us as individuals. So in Australia, our Federal Minister, Greg Hunt, last year in the Medical Journal of Australia, took on the challenge of predicting the future of healthcare, and of course he has some authority to do so. And he said then that there's a clear sense of direction for reforming the health system, and I'm glad he's got a clear sense. I'm struggling to see the clarity of the direction, but I think we all have a commonality of thought. And here we already see him predicting the focus they were going to have on aged care as well as sport, and the impact they plan to have on private health insurance and the workforce generally, and mental health. The following edition of the Medical Journal of Australia gave opportunity for the Shadow Minister, Catherine King, to provide her thoughts, and she highlighted what she called the chronic disease crisis. Personal and social harms were coming about as a result of these diseases, and the economic cost was highlighted. So talking about chronic diseases, and for a little while now I'm going to focus on my interaction with New South Wales Health because what I know, but the Agency for Clinical Innovation in New South Wales presented this model of care for chronic disease just recently, and this particular one is looking at osteoarthritis chronic care processes. And it is a new model of care because it places doctors and other therapists and clinicians in a model that perhaps is quite innovative. The patient is there at the middle with with their osteoarthritis here, and the carer and the musculoskeletal coordinator are there immediately surrounding the patient or the person. Primary care physicians, GPs, come into the next circle, so it's a bit more spread out, and environmental things are brought into consideration around that. But in this penultimate white circle sitting there, we see a range of potential interactions with group of people, group of processes that hadn't necessarily been regarded as an intimate connectivity with health, and then our medical specialists around the outer ring. And when we put these things together, we see that this model presents an opportunity for a whole set of new industries that are going to be taking part in health, including things like life coaching, personal trainer, stress management, technology, dramatic, I've got to say, making not only exercises more fun, but facilitating that and making interactions very, very different. Home and urban design to facilitate healthier lifestyles and many more. And as these opportunities for new industries grow and expand, there's also opportunities for people who in the past may have been regarded as non-clinicians to be joining in on the health industry. Research scientists who've been non-clinical, architects, landscape and urban designers, engineers, IT and software designers, sales and marketing, healthcare providers and funders, and many more. And to highlight the industrial conversion of health, just want to point here that in the top right-hand corner, personal health and ageing has been listed as one of the 7 emerging industries in the formative stages of growth within the ASEAN and neighbouring nations. And having said that, and this was a report which came out only just this year, having said that, the other 6 industries there all seem to have quite an intimate relation, I think, in the future of healthcare as well. So the healthcare team has been made up of a group of clinicians that we've been working with for a long time now, and it's even hard to list all of them. But should we be working now also with architects, engineers, non-clinical scientists, IT and software designers, landscape and urban designers, and economists as part of our healthcare team? And at what level should we be working with them at? Should some of them be intimate with direct patient contact to understand what it is that we need to be delivering so they can design better? And I put politicians in there because I can't see how we can escape from including them in our process, and I don't think they see how they can escape from being part of it either. I can't leave the talk without at least mentioning the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And I want to just highlight, firstly, the third point down, where the people who have designed the National Disability Scheme have said this is not a health scheme. And yet it's interesting that all the other dot points overlap significantly with rehabilitation medicine and rehabilitation broadly. And indeed, whilst this is not a health scheme, it's one of the things that highlights that rehab medicine and rehabilitation broadly actually expand beyond health into the community determinants of health and some of the drivers of health and function that aren't traditionally regarded in health. So why is there disruption in the health systems? We've heard a lot of it during this Congress, so I'm not going to dwell on this slide except to highlight again that we do have changing definitions of health. There is evolving understanding of health and disease. Politics is now intimate. Technology is driving changes at all levels. There's a growing number of professionals claiming a space in the health delivery area. Consumers are demanding a voice. Population health versus personal health is a growing area, and economics is a key driver. So what's the role of rehabilitation medicine in all this? Well, I won't spend a lot on defining what rehab medicine is because you all know and understand this, I'm sure, except to highlight the point that rehab medicine is very focused on recovery, prevention, adaptation and compensation to maximise the prioritised functions, independence and quality of life of individuals with an awareness of the interactions between individuals, their community and the environment. And that this exists not just in the traditional subacute phase, but also is now recognised as being a key element in maximising recovery, starting in the acute phase and continuing throughout a long patient journey well into the post-acute phase. So what's the role of rehabilitation medicine? Well, within the team, whatever the team consists of, sorry, I'm not sure what that was, but it was a reminder, I don't know. Within the team, there's an accurate, rehab medicine provides, or hopes to provide at least, an accurate assessment of the impact of health in a biopsychosocial model on disability of an individual and the impact at a community level, a determination of prognosis, and facilitating and maximising and maintaining recovery, function, independence and quality of life. Research, I think, is unfortunately underdone still in rehab medicine. As a relatively young specialty, we've got a long way to go to catch up with our peers. But it is imperative that we do carry through with research in rehab medicine. And the focus has to be on what are the factors involved in healing and recovery. And not only what are the factors, but how do we enhance healing and recovery? What are the determinants of and the factors causing or facilitating disability? How do we prevent loss or reduction of function? The epidemiology of disability, the models of care, how we implement them. And one of our greatest challenges, in fact, is identifying the correct outcome measures in rehab and in function disability. This again is part of New South Wales Health and is one of the things I've worked on. This was a model of care for rehabilitation as put out by the Agency for Clinical Innovation in 2015. Highlights a lot of points and is relatively simple. The points are that rehabilitation does span a number of care settings. The care settings are highlighted there, including in-reach or acute and subacute and ambulatory care, a day hospital, ambulatory care as an outpatient where we have individual therapists, not so much the whole team as is part of the day hospital model, ambulatory care at home and outreach. I put this up to have a simple model in your mind because earlier this year, this model was put out also by ACI, and as you can see, it's far more complex. I was also part of the working group for this, but I want to, in putting this up, remember Dr. Gary Pearce, the late Dr. Gary Pearce, who co-chaired this working party and had an untimely death towards the completion of this model, and he was a key driver for innovation within our faculty. The only point I want to make on this slide, apart from its complexity as a program logic model, is that this now includes telehealth as part of the care settings. But I do want to highlight here just a few of the lines here which highlight the main activities of rehab medicine and rehabilitation more broadly. And that is that it remains at the bottom, starting from the bottom working up, it's person-centred assessment, treatment and education and care, it's goal-oriented, that the therapeutic interventions promote recovery, adaptation, compensation and prevention, and enable not only the individual but also using the environment to provide a facilitatory process for recovery. That the impacts are to reduce adverse impacts for individuals as well as networks and communities and families. And the aims ultimately are to contribute to the health and well-being of the community through enhanced resilience of people with a disability, enhanced community participation for people with a disability, reduced cost of social services and reduced disease burden and reduced cost of health care. It's a very difficult aim to achieve. I had this up as an example of where research in rehabilitation can be taking place. I don't know if I have time to go through it very much, but when we look broadly at the role of rehab medicine in this evolving system, the role now becomes helping to identify the purpose and the membership of evolving teams, what teams are relevant for where, and where does the clinical leadership come from. It also an evolving understanding of healing and recovery, not just health. Dealing with the increasing demand of populations for community rather than institutionalised, for returning to community rather than going to institutions, and using medical and technological advantages as well as choosing the right team, minimising the taxpayer dollars, and advocacy being incredibly important. We've heard some great talks on advocacy during this Congress as well. And rehab medicine have its own particular agendas for advocacy, noting that there are now different ways we can advocate, with the social model for advocacy being apparently the preferred one. So coming to the conclusion, we have to ask the questions again: what actually is health? What is disability? What is illness in our current environment? We can look at biomedical and biopsychosocial contexts. We can look at the culture and the political and the environmental and economic context. And we have to look at the evolving definitions. And I ask the question, are we actually going back to the future as we recognise some of the breadth of what we've covered? Need to comment, and one of the things I wanted to comment about environmental processes, we've heard a lot about the negative impacts of environment with global warming and the rest. But I think that we do need to have an increasing focus on how environments can have a healing role as well, and have that as part of our conversation. Disrupting forces, shifting balances are multifactorial. I've only covered a few of them in this presentation. And the role of rehab medicine is to be a leader in the science of recovery and health maintenance, to translate the science into meaningful outcomes for the patient and the community, and to maintain a high and strong voice for advocacy. I quote Lao Tzu here from the 6th century BCE. I'm a firm believer, I really like this quote: if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. And whether you want to regard this as a philosophy or even a law of physics, nevertheless, it applies to much of what we're doing. But whilst we maintain this emphasis and this focus on change, I thought I'd look back to the beginning, to the legacy of Hippocrates, and note that he was still regarded as the personification of the ideal physician. He was wise, caring, compassionate, and honest. And I'm not sure where I read those words in any of the papers I've quoted throughout this talk. And the commentary that he says, we need to make a habit of two things: to help or at least do no harm. And I have to ask the question that maybe some things should never change. Thank you.